We have one speaker remaining on the program today. He is Dr. Grant Mehring. He's a Wheat Technology Product Manager for Westbred. Go ahead, Dr. Mehring.
All right. Thank you very much. Happy to do that. First of all, good morning to everyone. We will finish up the small grains update here and just getting my screen shared successfully. If they aren't shared, Gary, just let me know. All right, well, Grant Mehring, thank you for the introduction. My last chance to speak on the small grains update was something like 2017, and that was when it was in person. You go to something like 9 towns, and 2 memories I have from that were curling in Stephen for a group outing in the evening at the Stephen Curling Club, and going out for an adult beverage at the Black Cat in Thief River Falls. Now, this year, we won't get to do such things as that, but this small grains update meeting is famous for great experiences. Lots of people packing small locations throughout the state of Minnesota, and I'm really happy to be speaking today. Now, I'm a Westbred tech rep. I cover the wheat seed varieties, winter wheat and spring wheat. But today I'm gonna largely take off my Westbred hat and mostly just talk to how do we move wheat yields up? What are different management practices that we should be thinking about? Get the creative juices flowing, the wheels spinning for looking at 1 to 2 new practices for you all to consider in 2021. Before we go into those practices, I'm going to hit on the 3 premises that I like to consider when you look at increasing your wheat yields up. What are the premises we're working on? Well, the first one is this. As Minnesota wheat is based out of the Red Lake Falls area, I used Red Lake County as the center, used 4 counties in Minnesota here. I'm giving you the 5-year USDA NASS averages reported to the USDA for spring wheat harvested yields for each of these counties: Marshall, Polk, Pennington, and Red Lake. What was reported is 59 bushel in Marshall, 63.3 bushel in the large Polk County, 61.8 in Red Lake County, and 60.6 in Pennington. Now, apologies to anyone who farms north of there, south of there, east or west of there, but I just wanted to kind of set the premise in this big wheat growing area of Minnesota. We know that in wheat, you can go field to field, operation to operation, yields swing wildly. There are ways to produce 100 bushel wheat. You can produce 40 bushel wheat depending on the management and the environment. So yields do swing a lot. But we also know that there's farm averages that are under these averages, farm averages at these averages, and farm averages well over. Now, the premise here is there is an opportunity to increase yield. Question yourself, are you leaving yield on the table? Are there practices you could move to that would start chinking your yield up? I'm thinking yes. Even those who are really pushing their yield, there's still ways to do more. So look at that yield potential, that yield goal for 2021. I think there's room for improvement. Secondly, what is the yield ceiling of your wheat variety? Now, this is a fancy figure. There's no varieties ascribed here to protect the innocent, if you will. But what you see here is the variety in black has a higher yield ceiling than the variety in red. The variety in red really only wants to go to 70 to 80 bushels an acre, even at the highest yield environments, which we have in the far right of this figure. Whereas the variety in black wants to reach to 80 to almost 195 or so bushels an acre. So look at the yield ceiling of your variety. Jim Anderson just presented some nice data on yield ceilings of different varieties. Look at that small plot, take it to the farm, and think about your variety's yield ceiling. Some varieties have a high ceiling, some just don't. And third, we're pushing yields up. Well, what can happen in spring wheat? Standability can be affected. Here's my favorite photo that I got collected for me from Arthur, North Dakota, 2019. This was after 2 days in a row of 2 inches of rain. This lodging on a wheat strip trial. Each of these was a different variety. The field was a different variety that you can kind of see around the trial. That lodging decreases yields. It decreases harvestability, the speed at which you can harvest, and it makes for a management nightmare. This wheat had to get sprayed with Prosaro just after this. How were they going to do that with this wheat flat on the ground? Standability affects a lot of things on your wheat operation. So we need to make sure standability is still good through many different practices. I'm going to go into here 12 ideas for increasing wheat yields. These are 12 ideas that I like to talk about a lot. These aren't all the ideas. For instance, I'm not going to go into applying your nitrogen. Joel Ransom and others have talked about that at length. I won't get into that today all that much. I'm not going to get into micros or sulfur today. I won't talk about biologicals. I really won't get too deep into any of the diseases. A little bit on maybe head scab towards the end, but we won't talk about tan spot, bacterial leaf streak, FHB, or wheat stem sawfly, for instance. And we'll leave out anything about pre-harvest, swathing, pre-harvest desiccating, how do you time harvest. I won't talk about that. But I'll give you 12 good ideas, hopefully, to really improve what you think about your wheat operation. I'm going to go through a list like this. This will be the format you'll see today. Maximizing wheat yield, what we've learned, where we can go. Go through 12 things here, and I'll talk about these first 3 buckets together. First, you're going to plant some spring wheat. Plant certified seed over the bin run. Well, we would ascribe a cost to bin run seed, somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 a bushel. We know certified seed costs more than $7 a bushel or so, but planting certified seed brings yield. You have plumper seed, you have, generally speaking, purer seed, and many other aspects about certified seed that bump that yield potential up just a little bit. At Westbred, ours are certified seed only varieties. I have that emblem here. We require the planting of certified seed, but for all spring wheat varieties, planting certified seed is the best first step. When you purchase certified seed, that gives you the opportunity to then plant the right varieties. You're not forced into picking what you have in the bin or in your bin at home. You can choose a variety, 2, 3, or 4 that will best work on your farm. How do you plant the right variety? Well, you're going to look at data. Jim Anderson just showed a lot of great data. You could look at the Prairie Grains magazine from a few months back, and you could see data from a few private companies, other public entities. There's other sources of data on farm trials like I provide, as well as what you hear in the coffee shop and on your own farm. Plant the right varieties. Try one new variety next year is really a great concept. Throw out the worst variety, move in the next best. And then you've got the right variety, you've got certified seed. When you get certified seed, the opportunity to treat with fungicide and insecticide is just easier. It's more streamlined. We know in our variable climates, we do not know what planting will be like in 2021, but using a fungicide or an insecticide tree treatment helps hedge against that planting environment. If it's cold and wet, hot and dry. The first data slide I want to get into is right here. This comes from Andrew Friskop, and I just love this figure that he shows and he talks about. They have something like 250 trials collected, 210 trials across North Dakota, and how that seed treatment affected yield. Well, what you see here, there's 2 aspects to this. 6.5% better stand when you treat versus no treatment. That's key. You've invested in certified seed, you picked the right varieties. That seed treatment protects those live seeds. Less seeds die. And 73% of the time that happened. I love that aspect. And he actually revised that. I saw Andrew speak a week or so back, and now it's up to about 9% stand increase on seed treatment. These are variable seed treatments from different companies, but that's the combined data. At the same time, he saw a 3% yield increase across these variable trials and an 80% win rate. 80% of the time, there was higher yield, or 80% of the time using a seed treatment won, and it was 3% yield increase. Now, some of these environments come from root rot areas where there was just a higher pressure on that emerging seed. Some of them came from areas where there was nothing to be seen, no problem with the seed growing. But overall, 3% yield increase. Moving to the next batch of management practices. All right, number 4 is check your seed depth and calibration at planting. This buckets into things you can do right when you're about to go plant your spring wheat. What can you do to prepare well? Well, first, field to field, check for seed depth. We don't need to be seeding shallower than 1 inch. You get root lodging then. We don't need to be seeding deeper than 2 inches. Your wheat seed will have a harder time getting out of the ground. Check seed depth. And it's an easy thing that takes just a minute of checking. Secondly, calibration. Different wheat varieties have different shaped seeds. Now I understand a wheat seed is a wheat seed. But for instance, even with me, I've got Westbred 9590 that's a little bit longer and slender kernel. I've got WB 9719 that's a shorter, plumper kernel. Those seeds feed over the meter in your air cart differently. And just simply calibrating your different varieties, taking the 5 minutes to do that, will ensure you're planting the correct seeding rate. And a third thing in this bucket number 4 is just make sure you have seed flowing out of every row unit. It may seem obvious, but every year I get a question or two. How do I go back and fill in skips? I got 6 foot, 8 foot skips in a field. What should I do? And you know, we can drive the countryside and we can all see where a row unit was plugged in spring wheat early on in the growing season. It probably only happens to the neighbor, but at the end of the day, let's just all be checking our air seeders to make sure we don't have row units plugged. Okay, number 5 is using a starter fertilizer. Now I know this has grown into a common practice as we have 2 or 3 bins in our air seeders, but using a starter fertilizer, getting that P and K on through the starter, gets your seed off to the best possible start. Now we don't know if it'll be a long, cool growing season in the early part of the season in 2021, or if it won't. But look at this picture. This is winter wheat in tough winter in Kansas. That middle strip didn't have a starter fertilizer, whereas everything around it did. And we just see the benefit on, in that case, winter survival, but also tillering. Early season growth of your wheat plant, be it spring wheat or winter wheat, is important. Let's keep that wheat growing well early in the season and use a starter fertilizer. Next, planting on seeds per acre and not on pounds per acre. Now, I have talked about this concept with many of the people in this meeting many times, but I will, at the risk of belaboring it, I'm going to talk about it again. 2 critical aspects in seeds per acre is getting the correct population. We want to get the correct population. Don't overseed or underseed your spring wheat. That seed, it's not a huge cost, but is a cost that should not be wasted. Second, variety dependent seeding rates. Jim Anderson just talked about issues in variety MN Lang with seeding rates. Varieties have different seeding rates, and we want to be getting them right if possible. How can I show that to you all, just as a way to reiterate this, even though most of you know this? Well, different seed lots have different seed weights. Here we have SY Soren that's 27 grams per 1,000 kernels. We have Linkert that's more moderate, and we have WB 9590 that's a big seed. If we're seeding on the left 2 bushels an acre, you can see that seeding rate, 2 bushels an acre. We would seed the Soren at 2 million seeds an acre, the Linkert at 1.7 million seeds an acre, and the WB 9590 at 1.4 million seeds an acre. The difference between those 3 seed lots is 500,000 seeds. We don't need to be wasting 500,000 seeds. We want to be planting the right seeding rate, not overseeding, underseeding. Use your seed weight, use germination, do that quick math and get to the right seeding rate. Number 7 is practicing a crop rotation. Minnesota is a fascinating place to think about spring wheat crop rotations. We've got sugar beets, we've got soybean wheat rotations, and we've got everything in between. I've got down here in the bottom left, there are tiers of crops to rotate into with wheat. Now, Jared talked earlier about how wheat helps the yield of other crops. I'm going to complete that circle and talk about how other crops help the yield of your spring wheat. In eastern North Dakota and Minnesota, dry beans, canola are the best crops to rotate to, highest yield potential. Next, you've got probably field pea and soybean. And in the third tier, the least desirables would be corn, sunflower, wheat. Yield potential ranks out. Now in western North Dakota or South Dakota, where we just have a bit of a lower rainfall scenario on the whole, the tiers are a bit different. I have them here. Field pea, lentil in the first tier, canola, wheat in the second tier. Actually, wheat's a low water user. So in real dry situations, it's okay to rotate to wheat. And the third tier would be that corn and sunflower. But crop rotation is a way to work towards better yields in wheat as well as your other crops. Focus on your crop rotation, study them, stick to them, do what you can to help have crop rotation increase your yields. Next is soil testing and fertilizing to yield and protein goals. Now, I won't speak to this one too in depth. This one is a long concept, a long topic. It really depends on what you're rotating to, what your practices are, what your yield goals are. But I want to give you just one way of thinking about it. You know, a question I get often is, should I use Dave Franzen's calculator online? Should I use pounds of nitrogen per bushel? And I'm just going to give you an example of both for nitrogen. Two options here. Fertilizing based on your yield goal. You know, it's commonly talked about 2.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of wheat to 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of wheat. The other concept is using Dave Franzen's N calculator on the NDSU website. That takes into account where you're growing your wheat, your average rainfall, and your overall yield goals, low, medium, high, and gets you to a nitrogen rate. Now, in this example, I'm just giving you 70 bushel yield goal for wheat after soybeans. Using that 2.5 pounds of N per bushel gets you to 175 pounds of nitrogen. Using Franzen's calculator gets you to 185 pounds of nitrogen. And he always wants you to think about plus or minus 30 pounds, common sense. We see they arrived at a fairly equal fertilizer rate. Now, I just want to give you that information to think about. Nitrogen is one of the things your crop will need if you start pushing for higher yields. It needs nitrogen, a good solid rate, especially if you want to keep your protein level at 14% roughly. So my concept here is really, we want to mostly front load our nitrogen in spring wheat. The split applying has been a bit variable in results, but really do leave that 30 pounds in case you want to respond to the environment. If you've got a bin buster wheat crop coming, or if you have a really poor wheat crop coming, you can respond with that 30 pounds or not respond. Two more topics here to talk about for you. Scouting and applying fungicides and insecticides as needed. Now we know we're in an area where fungicides get sprayed widely in spring wheat, both early season with the herbicide and for that head scab timing. I'm not going to speak too specifically to any individual product here or the cost of those products, but talk about the concept. Spraying spring wheat. We know we get out there and we spray a lot of our crops in the north. We spend a lot of time in our sprayer. What should we be doing? How many fungicide passes does your wheat crop warrant? A lot of people are asking this question of themselves. There's one situation where you're just going to put a fungicide with your herbicide and move on. It's drier environment. We're not worried about head scab. More typical in the middle, we've got that herbicide fungicide and we've got that scab fungicide, a 2 fungicide approach. And we have various folks working on that third fungicide application. Do we warrant a flag leaf application? In other presentations, I talk very detailed about the data on that. In this presentation, I won't talk about the data. I'll just leave you with the fact that there's other folks working on it. There's data to be found on Farm Research Network and others. The longer your growing season, the more benefit you have of that flag leaf, the longer time between the flag leaf and the scab fungicide. And keeping that wheat healthier, the flag leaves healthier, does make some sense in some of our diseased environments. Ask yourself this question. Consider if you want to look at a second or a third, depending on where you farm wheat. And lastly, we've got all these great practices that we've talked about. I want to make sure we're paying attention to keeping our wheat erect and not lodged. Not a lot we can do about this besides, seeding rates and maybe plant growth regulators, but we really want to focus on keeping that wheat erect. We know lodging decreases yield. The names of these varieties have again been removed to protect the innocent. That variety on the left has a lodging score of 1 at harvest. It was 85 bushels an acre in the plots. The variety on the right was a typical of a lodged variety. It was a lodging score of 7. It yielded 69 bushels an acre. And these two varieties are even yielders when there's no lodging. So in this environment, 2018 Ada, it was a 16 bushel yield hit for lodging. And now we think about our wheat field looking like that variety on the right. We are going to not be happy harvesting that with our combines. It's going to slow us down. It's going to cause other issues. There is a yield hit as your lodging score goes down. There's also a combine efficiency hit as your lodging score goes down. We want to keep working on keeping our wheat standing, picking varieties that stand. We know that our wheat will be better when that's the case. Okay. Now I'll move into conclusions. I'm going to go through every one of these management practices one by one, and I'm not going to give you the numbers, work through the math for you, but just to talk about what is the numbers that might be used if you're looking at your cost of production and thinking about what I can add in or not. First of all, planting certified seed. I told you earlier, there's a cost to bin run seed. Every farmer ascribes a different cost to it, depending on if you're just pulling it out of the bin, if you're treating it, if you're getting it cleaned. But there's a cost. I like to think about roughly a $7 to $7.50 a bushel cost to bin run seed, whereas certified is going to be, higher than that. We know in the $10 to $13, $14 a bushel range. So there's a cost difference there, but there's also a yield difference potentially. We talk about sometimes, 2 to 3% better yields with certified seed. Planting the right varieties. Now, beyond buying the new seed, this is free. This just takes talking with your crop consultant, your retail seller, looking at the data yourself, any data you can get your hands on, and trying to pick the right varieties. It's a free management practice that can really help move yields up. Treating seed with a fungicide or insecticide. We might say about $1 for some kind of would be your cheapest seed treatment. And if you're going to put on some micronutrients, we might be up in that $4 to $5 a bushel range. It's a cost, but to protect your seed investment and that 3% better yield, most of the time, it's a cost well spent. Here is a free practice: checking your seed depth, checking your calibration, looking to make sure all your row units are not plugged. It's a quick thing, relatively quick, it's free, and it can make for a better planting, higher yield potential. Using starter fertilizer, in most cases, we're just allocating that starter fertilizer down the tube or side by side instead of broadcasting. So this isn't typically a cost as long as you have the air cart that has the technology to do that. Planting on seeds, seeding rate, paying attention to your seeding rate. Generally speaking, this is free. You just need to do the math. You need to do the math yourself on your germination, your seed count. You might have to, if it's bin run seed, you might have to grab that seed out of the bin, do a ragdoll test, and check the weight on it, either sending it off to the lab or doing it on your kitchen scale. But this is free. Just do the math to convert your pounds per acre, your bushel per acre into seeds per acre. Crop rotations. Now, on the surface, this is a free concept, but it's not necessarily free because there's opportunity costs lost and gained. But think about your crop rotations. Spend time looking at this. There's all kinds of tools available to really think about what crop rotations are best, in addition to the immense experience you have on your own farm with your crops. Optimal planting date. I didn't speak about this much earlier, but most years, early seeding wins. So pushing, getting ready, be prepared to plant wheat when the time is right. Having number 4 done and number 6, have the early season stuff done, your seeding rates, checking your air seeder. Soil testing, fertilizing. This might be a big cost if we're going to be putting on more fertility, the cost of zone sampling with soil testing, but it's a cost well spent. Controlling weeds to avoid moisture, nutrient loss, and diseases. I didn't hit on this earlier. Largely, we think about controlling weeds in spring wheat being priceless. We'll spend whatever money we need to get the fields clean. We want the rest of our crops to go into, we have enough options to control weeds in wheat that we want to set up the rest of our years of production for other crops well. We know that in crop though, controlling weeds in your wheat increases yields just because you have moisture and nutrients not being taken by the weeds. Scouting and applying fungicides. Here's a cost. If you don't spray any fungicide, you're at $0. If you're spraying a generic with the herbicide, you're at something like $5. You could maybe be up to about $30 an acre if you're spraying 3 fungicides. But my close colleague at Bayer, Kevin Thorsness, we talk about Prosaro. Compared to untreated wheat, we're looking at about a 6 bushel an acre increase with Prosaro at 6.5 ounces. About 9 bushels at the higher rate of Prosaro, 8.2. There's yield to be gained when we spray head scab fungicide. And lastly, keeping our weed erect. I spoke on this earlier, but there's yield to be gained, sometimes as much as 15 to 20 bushels an acre, not lodged wheat versus lodged. There's harvest efficiency and time, speed of the combine to be gained. My conclusions for you all are, number 1, question your yield potential. Are you leaving yield on the table? Then take a look at your cost of production. Know it. See where you could maybe add or maybe there isn't room. Then do the little things right. The little free things that don't cost you money, maybe a bit of time, but that really help you set you up for higher yield. And now, of all these options I gave you and other options that I didn't speak about, consider 1 free input for next year. Consider 1 input that costs you money. Try them next year on a small amount of acres. Make small changes every year, test them, and 2022 will even better with what you learned in 2021 for increasing your yields in spring wheat. I want to thank you for your time. I will field any questions now. Just let me know.